Have you ever loved someone so much you defended a part of them that made absolutely no sense to anyone else? For me, that was my husband Ben's obsession with ham radio. Our spare bedroom wasn't a guest room or an office. It was the shack. The name always made me smile, conjuring images of a dusty shed, when the reality was a room humming with the clean, quiet energy of expensive electronics. A galaxy of little lights blinked from black boxes connected by a spaghetti-like maze of wires that Ben had meticulously organized and labeled. From the window, you could see the base of the monstrous antenna he'd bolted to our roof, a metallic spider stretching its legs toward the sky. My sister Linda never understood. "I just don't get it, Sarah," she'd say over a perfectly clear FaceTime call. "He's got a top-of-the-line smartphone. Why spend thousands of dollars on all that junk just to talk to some other guy in Brazil about atmospheric conditions? It's weird." And I would launch into my well-practiced defense. I'd explain that it wasn't about just talking. It was about the challenge. It was about bouncing a signal off the ionosphere with nothing but physics, skill, and a few hundred watts of power. Ben is a quiet man, an engineer who sees the world as a series of interconnected systems. For him, making contact with a stranger in a distant country using his call sign, Whiskey Alpha 7 Tango Delta Echo, wasn't just a conversation. It was proof that he understood the system. It was his art. Seeing his face light up with a focused, brilliant joy as a voice crackled back through the static was all the justification I ever needed. I loved that brilliant, focused part of him, so I loved his strange, noisy hobby too. I stood in the doorway of the shack that afternoon, watching him adjust a dial with surgical precision. Through the window behind him, the sky was turning the color of a deep, ugly bruise, and the pines at the edge of our property were starting to thrash violently. The wind was making the overhead power lines sing a nervous, high-pitched tune, a sound that always set my teeth on edge. Our little town, nestled in a valley, was notorious for losing its connection to the outside world. The cell signal was fickle on a good day, and the slightest storm could knock out the internet for hours. I felt that familiar, nagging worry begin to prickle at the back of my mind, that uniquely modern anxiety of being completely and utterly cut off, but I pushed it down. We had candles and a generator for the freezer. The lines always came back on. Eventually, "Dinner soon?" I asked, my voice a little too loud over the growing roar of the wind. Ben didn't look up, just gave a slight nod, his focus absolute. He was listening to something I couldn't hear, a ghost of a voice buried in a sea of static. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and for a split second, the blinking lights of his equipment were washed out, his face a stark, shadowy mask of concentration. The thunder that followed wasn't a distant rumble. It was a physical blow, a deafening crack that shook the entire house. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, relieved to see the little bars of service still clinging to life. It was a text from Linda. "Just talked to Mom. She's fine, but her power's already flickering. Said her neighbor's big oak looks like it's about to go. You guys okay?" My heart did a painful little flip. Our mother lived alone, just on the other side of the valley. After her bout with pneumonia last winter, she was on an oxygen concentrator at night, a machine that needed electricity to pull the very air into her lungs. She had a small backup tank, but it was only good for a few hours. I typed back quickly, my thumbs fumbling. "Storm's bad here too. Keep me posted if you hear from her again. I'll try her landline." Before I could even hit send, the lights in the shack flickered once, twice, and then died. The humming of the electronics, the refrigerator, the digital clock in the hall, all of it vanished. The silence that replaced it was profound, instantly swallowed by the shriek of the wind. The only light came from the battery-powered display of Ben's main transceiver, casting a faint, eerie green glow on his face. My phone's screen went from one bar of service to a single damning phrase, "No service." Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I rushed to the kitchen and grabbed the landline. The receiver was dead in my hand. No dial tone, nothing. We were in a black hole, cut off. And my mother, on the other side of the valley with a failing power grid and a giant, threatening oak tree, was on a timer. The image of her, alone in the dark, struggling to breathe, flashed in my mind. I remember that feeling of pure, cold dread, the kind that hollows you out from the inside. And before I go on, before I tell you what happened next, what Ben did in that moment, if you're finding your way to this story, if you've ever felt that kind of helplessness, please hit that like button. Subscribing would mean the world too. It helps more people find this, and honestly, it helps me to know you're out there listening. Because in that darkness, surrounded by the storm's fury, I felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. I turned back toward the shack, my eyes adjusting to the gloom, and I saw it. Ben hadn't moved. He was calmly slipping on his headphones, his hand reaching not for a dead phone, but for the microphone of his radio. The green light of his console glowed with a steady, defiant pulse. "What are you doing?" The words came out as a strangled whisper, sharp with a frantic energy that felt alien in the sudden, oppressive quiet of the house. "Ben, what are you doing? We have to do something." My mind was a whirlwind of useless, panicked plans. Should I try to drive? The roads would be flooded, and a downed tree could trap us. Should I just wait? Wait for how long? Every tick of the clock I could no longer hear was a second of oxygen my mother might not have. The helplessness was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. And my husband, my brilliant, logical husband, was putting on headphones. He glanced at me, and in the ghostly green light of his transceiver, his expression wasn't panicked. It was the same look he had when he was deep in a complex engineering schematic, intense, focused, and utterly present. "I'm doing something, Sarah," he said, his voice calm and even. He turned a knob, and a new layer of static hissed to life. Panicking isn't a system. It doesn't have a solution. His calmness felt like an accusation, a wall I couldn't scale. I wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to make him feel the same jagged terror that was tearing me apart. But I just stood there, paralyzed in the doorway, watching as his fingers danced across the console. He picked up the microphone and pressed the button. "Whiskey Alpha 7 Tango Delta Echo," he said, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the storm's rage. Listening on the 2-meter repeater. "Is the net active?" Silence. Just the hiss and crackle, the sound of an empty universe. My hope, a tiny flickering thing, died. It was a game, a toy, a room full of expensive junk that couldn't even do the one thing we needed it to do. I felt a bitter, hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat. He released the button, waited, then pressed it again. "Whiskey Alpha 7 Tango Delta Echo, calling any station. Is there an active emergency net for the valley?" This time, a voice clawed its way out of the static. It was faint, distorted, but it was undeniably human. "Opie that, Whiskey Alpha 7. This is KC7ZYX. Net is active. All stations report emergency traffic only. We have KSSHHH widespread outages and reports of crackle flash flooding." Ben's eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a look of triumph, but of grim confirmation. He was in. He was connected. He had found a pulse where I had found only a void. He spoke into the mic again, his words precise and economical. "KC7ZYX. This is WA7TDE. I have a potential welfare check. An elderly woman on a medical device, power dependent, on the east side of the valley. Can anyone confirm if emergency services are operational over there?" I held my breath. The disembodied voice returned, clearer this time. "Negative, WA7TDE. Stand by." Another voice, rougher and more strained, broke in. "All stations be advised. We just got a report from a mobile unit near Blackwood Creek. The bridge is gone. I repeat, the Blackwood Creek Bridge has collapsed. Route 12 is completely impassable. The East Valley is cut off. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. Blackwood Creek Bridge, the only bridge, the only way across the valley. It wasn't just that the power was out. It wasn't just that the phones were dead. The physical world had broken. There was no driving over there. There was no getting to her. We were on one side, and my mother was on the other, with a collapsed bridge and a raging storm between us. The panic I'd felt before was a firefly compared to this new, all-consuming sun of dread. It burned away every frantic, half-formed plan, leaving behind only the cold, hard fact of our isolation. My eyes fixed on the green, glowing numbers of Ben's radio, the spaghetti maze of wires, the blinking lights, the monstrous antenna on the roof. It wasn't a hobby anymore. It wasn't a game. It was a lifeboat in the middle of a dark and shoreless ocean, and my quiet, focused husband was the only one who knew how to sail it. My breath hitched, a tiny, useless sound against the storm. The lifeboat. That's what I thought. But now I knew the truth. The lifeboat was adrift, and the official rescue ships, the ones you're taught to wait for your entire life, they weren't coming. They couldn't. No, I whispered, shaking my head as if I could deny the reality of a collapsed bridge. No, that can't be right. Ben, ask them about the emergency services. The real ones. The sheriff, the fire department. They have special trucks. They have plans for this. My voice was pleading, desperate to believe in the structures of the world I knew. A world where you could dial 3 numbers and help would arrive. Ben held up a hand for silence, his attention locked on the radio. Another voice crackled through, this one older, calmer. That's a good copy on the bridge, Mike. All stations, this is W7JRL. I have a visual on the highway from my position on the ridge. It's a parking lot. Multiple mudslides north of town. Nobody's getting in or out. My faith in officialdom was a stubborn, dying animal. Ben, please, I insisted, stepping closer, my hand gripping his shoulder. Ask them to contact the county. Patch you through to the dispatch center. They have to get someone to Mom. He looked at me then, and his eyes were full of a deep, weary patience. He knew what I was asking. He was asking me to trust his world, and I was still trying to drag him back into mine. But he nodded. He pressed the button on his microphone. WA7TDE to net control, he said. I have a request from my XYL. I knew that meant ex-young lady. Ham speak for wife. Can you relay a priority welfare check to the county EOC? Or is there a direct frequency for the sheriff's office? The reply from KC7ZYX, the first voice we'd heard, came back instantly, stripped of all pleasantries. His tone was frayed, stretched thin. Negative, WA7TDE. The EOC is compromised. We're getting unconfirmed reports their own generator failed. We are the EOC right now. We're logging all traffic and passing it to a state-level net. But that's all we can do. All first responders are engaged in active water rescues on this side of the valley. I'll say it again. The East Valley is physically inaccessible. We can add your mother's name and address to the log, but there is no one to send. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The 2 most useless words in the English language. A log. My mother's life, her struggle for every single breath in a dark, powerless house, was now a line item on a list, a piece of data to be filed away. The fury that rose in me was hot and pure. I wanted to grab the microphone from Ben's hand and scream into it, to rage at this faceless, overwhelmed voice, at the failed generator, at the very storm itself. But I didn't. I just stood there, the fight draining out of me, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. The system had failed. The professionals were gone. The tidy, organized world I believed in had been a fragile illusion, washed away in the floodwater. There was no 911. There was no cavalry. There was just the storm, the darkness, and the shack. There was just my husband, leaning into the green glow of his radio, listening to the scattered voices of strangers in the dark, his face a grim mask of resolve. He was all we had. I sank onto the floor, my back sliding down the doorframe of the shack. The cold wood did nothing to numb the awful heat of my panic. A log. My mother was a name on a list. Ben kept talking. his voice a low, steady murmur into the microphone, a counterpoint to the storm's chaotic symphony. He was gathering information, piecing together a mosaic of disaster from the fragments offered by other operators, a flooded road here, a downed power line there. He was building a new map of our broken world, a map made of radio waves. I watched him, a stranger in the familiar shape of my husband. I had always loved his focus, but now it felt like a betrayal. How could he be so calm, so methodical, when my world was ending? My anger had burned out, leaving behind the hollow, echoing space of despair. There was nothing to do. We were trapped on our side of the valley, and my mother was trapped on hers. All we could do was listen to the world fall apart, one crackled report at a time. Then came a sound that wasn't the wind or the rain or the thunder. It was a violent, percussive crack, followed by a sickening, grinding screech of metal against shingles. It came from directly above us. The whole house shuddered from the impact. Dust motes danced in the green glow of the transceiver. Ben went rigid, his hand frozen on the dial. He ripped the headphones off. "What was that? A tree?" I gasped, scrambling to my feet. "On the roof?" His eyes, wide with a new kind of alarm, darted from the ceiling to his main console. The steady green numbers on the display were flickering erratically. A high-pitched, angry whine started to emanate from one of the black boxes. He swore, a sharp, ugly sound I'd rarely heard from him, and flipped a switch. The whine died, but so did the faint hiss of the radio frequency. The shack was plunged into an even deeper silence, broken only by the storm. "The antenna," he said, his voice tight. "Something hit the antenna." He pointed to a meter on his main rig. The needle was slammed all the way to the right. "The SWR is infinite. It's a dead short. The feed line might be severed, or the whole array could be gone." The meaning of his technical jargon slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The lifeboat was sinking. The one thread connecting us to anyone, the one tool that gave us any agency at all, was broken. The monstrous metal spider on our roof, the thing I had merely tolerated, had become our lifeline, and now it was compromised. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "So that's it? It's over? We can't talk to them anymore?" Ben was already moving, pulling a heavy rain slicker from a hook by the door. He grabbed a large flashlight from a shelf and checked the beam. "No," he said, his jaw set. He wouldn't look at me. "No, it's not over." I knew what he was thinking before he said it. The realization was a fresh wave of ice water in my veins. "Ben, no, you can't. You can't go up there." He turned to me then, the beam of the flashlight illuminating the rain lashing against the window behind him. "I have to check the feed line. If it's just a loose connection at the base, I can fix it." "On the roof?" I shrieked, the word tearing from my throat. "In a lightning storm? Are you insane? You'll be killed." This wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't about a hobby or understanding a system. He was going to climb onto our roof in the middle of a hurricane to fix his radio. My defense of his obsession, my pride in his strange art, it all felt like a foolish, naive lie. The hobby I had learned to love was about to ask me to risk the man I loved more than anything. And for the first time, looking at his grim, resolute face, I was terrified he was going to let it. "You will not," I said, my voice low and shaking with a fury born of pure terror. I moved to block the doorway of the shack, as if my small frame could possibly hold him back. "This isn't a schematic, Ben. This isn't a puzzle. It's a lightning storm. You'll be a walking lightning rod up there. For what? A broken toy?" The word toy hung in the air between us, ugly and sharp. It was the ultimate betrayal of every defense I had ever mounted for him, for this room. I saw the hurt flash in his eyes, but it was instantly replaced by that same infuriating, implacable calm. "It's not a toy, Sarah." "You know that," he said, pulling the slicker on. "It's a copper wire. That's all. A simple, physical connection. If that one wire is severed, we have nothing. If it's intact, we have everything. We have a chance to find someone, anyone, on the other side of that bridge who can get to your mother. There is no other option." He was right, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. My arguments were the frantic flailings of a drowning person, while he was already calculating the distance to the shore. The world had broken, and my husband, the man I had always seen as quiet and withdrawn, was the only person with the audacity to try and piece a part of it back together. My panic wasn't a system, he'd said. He was right. My panic was a prison, and it was keeping me locked in this doorway while the clock ticked on my mother's life. A sudden, strange quiet fell. The wind, which had been a constant, shrieking presence, dropped to a deep, guttural moan. The rain, which had been hammering the roof, softened to a dense, heavy drumming. It was a lull, a temporary reprieve, a window. Ben's eyes met mine, and I saw the decision harden in his face. I have to go now. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The terror didn't vanish, but it changed shape. It was no longer a paralyzing force, but a clarifying one. He was going. With or without me. I could stand here and scream into the wind, or I could be part of the system he was trying to build. "Wait," I said, my voice finally steady. I stepped aside. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, surprised. I didn't run for the first aid kit or a phone that didn't work. I ran to the hall closet and pulled out the climbing rope we'd bought for a hiking trip years ago and never used. I grabbed the heaviest wrench from his toolbox. When I returned to the shack, I thrust them at him. "You're not going up there untethered," I said. It wasn't a question. "Tie one end to the workbench leg. It's bolted to the floor. Give me the flashlight. I'll hold the ladder." A flicker of something, surprise, gratitude, love, warmed his face. He didn't argue. He just nodded, looping the rope around his waist and securing it with a nod I'd seen him practice 100 times. He led the way to the garage, and we wrestled the heavy extension ladder out into the howling wind. I braced its feet against the saturated ground while he extended it up to the edge of the roof, just below the window of the shack. The metal was slick and cold under my hands. The wind tried to rip it from our grasp, a living thing fighting us. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice nearly stolen by the wind. "Keep the light on the base of the antenna. Yell if you see lightning close by." Then he started to climb. I stood on the churning lawn, rain soaking me to the bone in seconds, my hands gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles were white. I aimed the beam at the roof, illuminating the mangled base of his metallic spider. I watched my brilliant, focused, insane husband ascend into the heart of the storm. My entire world narrowed to that single, precarious figure against the bruised sky and the circle of light I was holding for him. My light trembled, but I held it steady, my own small act of precision in the chaos. Each rung Ben climbed was a separate eternity. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The wind tore at his slicker, threatening to turn him into a sail and rip him from the ladder. When he finally swung a leg over the gutter and onto the slick, treacherous shingles of the roof, my own legs felt weak with relief and a fresh surge of fear. He was up. He was in the belly of the beast. He crawled on his hands and knees toward the antenna's base, the safety rope trailing behind him like an umbilical cord connecting him to the house, to me. I followed his progress with the flashlight beam, the circle of light, a tiny island of clarity in the darkness. The beam found the culprit, a thick, splintered limb from the big pine, heavy as a railroad tie, had snapped off and slammed down onto the base of the antenna. It had crushed the thick black coaxial cable, the feed line, pinning it against the steel mast. The main connector had been ripped clean from its socket. Ben didn't hesitate. He braced himself against the pitch of the roof, the wrench in his hand, and began to work on the branch, using the tool as a lever. The muscles in his back and shoulders strained under the yellow plastic of his slicker. For minutes that stretched into an age, it was just the sound of his grunting effort and the groan of wood against metal. Finally, with a great heave, he dislodged the limb. It slid down the wet shingles with a hungry scraping sound and crashed into the bushes below. He was exposed now, a solitary figure on the highest point of our property. A flash of lightning, closer this time, lit the whole sky in a ghastly violet. The thunder was instantaneous, a physical concussion that vibrated through my bones. "Ben!" I screamed, my voice raw. He didn't look down. His fingers, which I'd only ever seen move with calm deliberation, were now a desperate blur. He had the severed connector in one hand and the crushed end of the cable in the other. He was trying to force a connection, to get a piece of the central copper wire to make contact inside the socket. It was a crude, desperate fix. The rain intensified again, the brief lull over. Another flash, this one directly overhead. In the strobe-like light I saw him flinch, his head ducked low. This was it. This was the moment I would lose him to this stupid, wonderful, terrible hobby. I squeezed my eyes shut, unable to watch. But he didn't fall. When I opened my eyes, he was still there. He was holding up his hand, not in a wave but with a thumb pointing skyward. A single, triumphant gesture in the heart of the chaos. He'd done it. Getting down was somehow worse than going up. He half slid, half climbed his way back to the ladder as I held the light, my entire body shaking. When his feet finally touched the ground, I threw myself at him, flashlight and all. He caught me, his arms strong and sure around me. We didn't speak. We just ran, slipping on the sodden grass, back into the garage, back into the house, leaving a trail of water and leaves behind us. We burst into the shack, gasping for air, the smell of ozone and wet earth clinging to us. He collapsed into his chair, dripping all over his expensive equipment, and flipped the power switch. The green display flickered to life, and a sound filled the room. A beautiful, glorious, hope-filled hiss of static. The hiss of the static was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of possibility. It was the sound of Ben, alive and beside me, not a tragic figure on a storm-racked roof. The adrenaline that had held me together like a steel frame suddenly dissolved, and a tremor started deep in my bones. I was freezing, my teeth chattering uncontrollably, and the sight of him, sopping wet and pale in the green glow, made my stomach clench with the memory of the lightning. The word I had thrown at him, toy, echoed in my mind, a sour, shameful taste. "Did it work?" I asked, my voice a broken whisper. Ben didn't seem to hear me. He had already slipped the headphones back on, his focus absolute. He was back in his system. He grabbed the microphone, his knuckles white. "WA7TDE to net control. Are you still there?" My station was offline. "Antenna issue, I'm back." We waited, a compressed eternity in the humming silence of the shack. I held my breath, praying to a universe I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Then, the voice of KC7ZYX crackled back, strained but clear. "Good to have you back, WA7TDE. We were worried when you dropped. What's your status?" "Status is wet," Ben said, a rare, grim humor in his voice. "But operational. The bridge is still out. Copy that. The EOC is still dark. Copy that. But the East Valley is not a black hole. There have to be other operators over there. Can you put out a call? Any station on the east side of Blackwood Creek, please respond." This was it. This was the plan I couldn't see, the next logical step my panicked mind had been unable to form. It wasn't about getting official help to her. It was about finding unofficial help that was already there. The system wasn't just the police or the fire department. It was a web of people, of strangers like Ben, sitting in their own shacks in the dark. KC7ZYX, the faceless net controller, became our dispatcher. All stations, this is KC7ZYX. Priority call for any station located east of the Blackwood Creek Bridge. Do we have anyone active on the east side of the valley? More static, more hissing, the sound of an empty void. My hope, so newly resurrected, began to wither again. It was too much to ask. A collapsed bridge, a failed power grid. What were the chances that someone over there had power, had an antenna, and was listening at this exact moment? Any station, East Valley, KC7ZYX repeated, his voice patient. We have a priority welfare check for a power-dependent medical patient. And then a new voice, faint, buried in the noise, but there. KSSSHH. This is Kilo Bravo 7 November Juliet Victor. I'm Crackle Mobile, just east of the creek. What's the traffic? I gasped, clapping my hands over my mouth. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped me. Mobile. He was in a car. He had power. He was there. Ben's eyes locked on mine, and I saw it. The brilliant, focused joy I had always loved. But now it was magnified, incandescent. He was proving his system. He was making his art. He was saving my mother. He keyed the mic, his voice a blade of calm precision cutting through the storm. KB7NJV, this is WA7TDE. Thank you for answering the call. I have an elderly woman, my mother-in-law, on a nighttime oxygen concentrator. Power is out. Her address is 412 Chestnut Lane. Can you advise on your proximity? I watched, my heart in my throat, as Ben jotted the stranger's call sign on his notepad. The disembodied voice came back, stronger this time, a miracle cutting through the static. Copy that. 412 Chestnut. I know the street. I'm less than 5 minutes away. I have a portable generator in the truck. I'm on my way. The words, "I'm on my way," were not a sound, but a physical force. They hit me and broke the dam of my terror, and I began to weep. It was a ragged, ugly sound, the kind of crying that comes from a place deeper than sadness, a place of pure animal relief. Ben kept his hand on the mic, his back to me, but his shoulders lost some of their rigid tension. He was still the captain, but the ship had been sighted. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. Ben spoke in quiet, clipped tones with KC7ZYX, confirming our location on a shared map, logging the details. I paced the hallway just outside the shack, unable to stay, unable to leave. The green glow from the doorway was no longer a beacon of defiance. It was a wound. Every hiss of static made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. The room was no longer a testament to my husband's passion. It was a memorial to the moment I watched him climb into a lightning storm. The spaghetti-like maze of wires looked less like organized genius and more like a tangle of tripwires and fuses, each one a potential catastrophe. Then the voice of KB7NJV returned. WA7TDE, I'm with your mother-in-law. She's okay, a bit shaken up. Generator is running and the concentrator is on. She's breathing easy. Ben let out a long, shuddering breath. He turned in his chair to look at me, and the exhaustion on his face was profound. He's there, Sarah. She's okay. I should have run to him. I should have wrapped my arms around him and thanked him for his brilliance, for his courage, but I couldn't move. My eyes were fixed on the main transceiver, the one whose display had flickered and died. I saw the lightning flash. I saw the needle slam to the right. I saw the look on his face when he said the antenna was gone. The hobby I had championed, the art I had so proudly explained to my sister, had nearly demanded my husband as its price. The joy I used to feel watching him was gone, replaced by the acrid taste of fear. He stood up, dripping water onto the floor, and reached for me. I flinched. It was involuntary, a recoiling from the man who had been on the roof. The man who had been willing to make that insane choice. The hurt in his eyes was immediate and deep, worse than when I'd called his radio a toy. Sarah? Don't, I whispered, my voice trembling. Don't touch me. You smell like the storm. It was a cruel, nonsensical thing to say, but it was the only truth I had. I looked at the shack. at the humming black boxes and their blinking lights, and I felt a cold, alien hatred for it all. I had defended this part of him, loved this part of him. But I never understood that for his system to truly work, it required a faith so absolute it bordered on self-destruction. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I would have nightmares not of the storm or the collapsed bridge, but of the steady green light of his console, the sound of static, and the terrifying, brilliant focus in my husband's eyes as he chose his art over his life. The silence in our house after the storm was worse than the noise. In the days that followed, as the power grid was slowly stitched back together and the road crews began clearing the mudslides, a quiet, heavy tension settled between Ben and me. I'd walk past the open door of the shack and see him sitting there, not talking into the ether, but methodically transcribing the audio logs from the night of the storm. He was building a case file. I avoided the room. The sight of his radio, the memory of that infinite SWR needle, made my stomach turn. I loved the man, but I was terrified of his conviction. 2 weeks later, the county held a town hall meeting in the high school gymnasium. It was meant to be a pat-on-the-back session, a chance for the officials to praise their own response. Director Evans, the county's emergency manager, a man with a politician's smile and soft, uncalloused hands, stood at a podium flanked by American flags. He spoke of unprecedented challenges and the heroic efforts of our first responders. He never once mentioned a failed generator or a compromised EOC. He never mentioned the East Valley being a black hole for 6 hours. My sister Linda sat beside me, her hand resting on my arm. Ben was on my other side, a thin manila folder on his lap. When Evans opened the floor for questions, Ben stood up. He walked to the microphone, and a hush fell over the room. Ben never spoke in public. Director Evans, he began, his voice as calm and steady as it was on the radio. I have a few points of clarification regarding the timeline of events. He opened the folder. At 1942, on the night of the storm, your emergency operations center went dark. Your primary and secondary generators failed. Is that correct? Evans' smile tightened. We faced some technical difficulties, yes, but at 1945, Ben continued, cutting him off cleanly. My station, WA7TDE, was informed by the volunteer net controller that no official assets could be dispatched to the East Valley due to the bridge collapse and your communications failure. For the next 4 hours, all emergency traffic, from active water rescues to priority welfare checks, was handled by a network of civilian amateur radio operators. Your system didn't have difficulties, Director. It ceased to exist. Ours worked. A murmur went through the crowd. Evans sputtered, calling them dedicated hobbyists and thanking them for their ancillary support. That word hobbyists broke something in me. The fear that had been living in my gut for 2 weeks turned molten. I stood up and walked to the mic next to my husband. Director Evans, I said, my voice shaking but clear. My mother was on the other side of that bridge. She needs a machine to breathe, and her power was out. Your office, the one my taxes pay for, told my husband you were adding her name to a log. A log. While you were doing that, my husband, one of your hobbyists, was climbing onto our roof in a lightning storm to repair a damaged antenna because it was the only way to get help. He had to risk his life because your multi-million-dollar command center didn't have a working generator. I pointed to a man in the third row, a burly guy in a flannel shirt who had been sitting quietly. That man, Frank, call sign KB7NJV, is the reason my mother is alive, not your first responders, not your log, a man in a truck with a radio and a generator. That wasn't ancillary support. That was the entire operation. The room was silent. The truth, laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights, was undeniable. Ben put his hand on the small of my back. It didn't feel like the hand of the man who smelled of the storm. It felt like the hand of the man who had sailed the lifeboat. We didn't just get an apology. In the weeks that followed, Director Evans resigned. Ben and Frank were appointed, unpaid, to a new civilian oversight committee. A new county ordinance was passed, formally integrating the amateur radio emergency net into the official county plan with funding for dedicated equipment at the EOC. They weren't hobbyists anymore. They were part of the system, a better, more resilient system that my husband, in his quiet, focused way, had proven was possible. Things didn't snap back to normal. Normal had been washed away with the bridge. In its place, a new reality settled in, brittle and strange. The town hall meeting wasn't a victory lap. It was the opening salvo in a long, quiet campaign. Ben's nights were now filled with committee meetings and policy drafts, his engineering mind meticulously dismantling and rebuilding the county's failed systems on paper. He and Frank, the man from the other side of the valley, became an unlikely team, a quiet engineer and a burly mechanic, bound by the shared language of call signs and a night of impossible odds. I went back to my life, but the storm had left a watermark on everything. Every time the wind blew, the memory of the ladder and the lightning would flash behind my eyes. I started avoiding the spare bedroom. The shack, once a source of fond exasperation, now felt like a wound in our home. I'd hurry past the open door, averting my eyes from the green glow of the console Ben always left on, a silent sentinel. The joy I'd once found in his passion had been replaced by a cold knot of dread. One Saturday, about 2 months after the storm, I found him standing in the doorway of the shack. Just as I had that first afternoon, he wasn't touching anything. He was just looking at the main transceiver, the one he'd risked his life for. "You haven't been on the air," I said, my voice soft. It was the first time I'd willingly brought it up. He shook his head, not looking at me. "Doesn't feel right. Every time I think about picking up the mic for fun, I see the SWR meter. I see the roof." He finally turned to me, his eyes filled with a weary sadness I hadn't seen before. "I scared you, Sarah. I know I did." The dam inside me finally broke. "You smell like the storm," I whispered, repeating my cruelest words. Tears pricked my eyes. "I'm so sorry I said that, Ben. I was just so terrified. All I could see was what I almost lost." "I was terrified too," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Up there, when the lightning flashed, I thought, this is a stupid way to die. But then I thought of your mom, and I thought of you holding that flashlight. You were my ground. You were the other half of the circuit." In the quiet of our hallway, we finally held each other, the ghosts of the storm receding. The healing wasn't a single event. It was 1,000 tiny moments of choosing to turn toward each other instead of away. A week later, I went out and bought a small, comfortable armchair and a reading lamp. I wrestled them into the shack myself and placed them in the corner opposite his desk. When Ben saw it, he just stared. "What's this?" "It's a listening post," I said, trying for a casual tone, "for your XYL, so I have somewhere to sit while you're proving your system." A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine, unburdened smile I'd seen in months. That night, for the first time since the storm, he sat down, put on his headphones, and spun the big dial. The familiar hiss of static filled the room, but this time, I didn't flinch. I sat in my new chair, curled my feet under me, and listened. He pressed the button. "Whiskey Alpha 7 Tango Delta Echo," he said, his voice hesitant at first, then growing stronger. "Calling CQ and listening." A few seconds later, a voice, impossibly clear and accented, came back. "JA1ABC, I hear you, Whiskey Alpha 7. Good evening from Tokyo." Ben's face lit up with that familiar, brilliant joy. He glanced at me, his eyes sparkling. He wasn't saving anyone. He wasn't fighting a storm. He was just talking, bouncing a signal off the ionosphere with nothing but physics and skill. It was his art. And sitting there, in the warm glow of my reading lamp, I finally understood. The shack wasn't a room full of wires to fear. It was a room full of connections. And I was finally truly a part of it. That armchair became my anchor. The shack was no longer a place I avoided, but a room we shared. Sometimes I'd read while Ben quietly logged contacts in a contest, the air filled with the Morse code he loved, a rhythmic tapping that sounded less like an alarm and more like a heartbeat. He never went on the roof again without me at the bottom of the ladder, holding it steady, a simple, unspoken pact between us. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had learned its place. It was a scar now, not an open wound, a reminder of the price, but also of what had been saved. The real change, the one that truly healed the last of the fracture between us, came 3 months later. As part of the new county plan he'd helped write, Ben agreed to teach a licensing course for new ham radio operators. He stood nervously at the front of a classroom at the community college, facing a dozen people, a retired librarian, a couple of high school kids, and even my sister Linda, who had driven up for the weekend, her face a mask of skeptical curiosity. He started awkwardly, fumbling with his notes, his voice barely a murmur, but then he put the papers down. He started talking about the ionosphere, about how solar flares on the sun could change the way you hear a voice from half a world away. He described the magic of building a simple wire antenna and throwing it up in a tree, of making a connection with nothing but a battery and a bit of physics. He wasn't just teaching technical regulations, he was sharing his art. The focused, brilliant joy I loved so much was back, not born of desperation in a storm, but of a pure desire to share, to connect. Watching him, I didn't see the man on the roof anymore. I saw a teacher, a leader, a quiet man who had found his voice and was now helping others find theirs. In the end, I learned that my well-practiced defense of his hobby had always been missing the most important part. It wasn't just about understanding the system. It was about what you do when the system breaks. It's about the people who, in the darkness, calmly slip on their headphones and start listening. It's about the strangers who answer the call. Ben's art wasn't just bouncing a signal off the sky. It was building a net of human connection strong enough to catch you when you fall. I no longer just defend that part of him. I cherish it. It's the part that saved us. And I guess that's the whole story. It's about the systems we trust and the ones we build ourselves. If you found your way here, if this story of connection meant something to you, it would mean the world to me if you'd hit that like button. Subscribing helps more people find this channel, and it's a good way of letting me know you're out there, listening.